Imagine spending years building a bond with your child, a bond you thought was unbreakable. But one quiet evening, one unexpected confession, changes everything. What would you do if the person you trusted most in the world suddenly revealed a love that was far beyond anything you had ever imagined? It was just a typical evening, a quiet night in after a long week, dinner together, a movie playing softly in the background, the kind of evening that had become a comforting routine. For Caroline, a mother of a 21-year-old son, James, there was nothing particularly unusual about it. They had always been close, mother and son, partners in their own way, sharing their thoughts and feelings without hesitation. But this night was different. James had changed. There was something in his eyes, a quiet shift that Caroline couldn't quite place. She noticed it when he laughed a little too softly at the movie, or when he seemed to retreat into himself during their conversation. A strange silence filled the room, and it wasn't the kind of silence that had ever been there before. Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that the peace they'd always known had been replaced by something unfamiliar, something unsettling. She couldn't have known then, but that evening would mark the beginning of a shift in their relationship, one that neither of them was ready for. The night started like so many others, but as they ate their dinner, Caroline noticed James's gaze linger on her a little longer than usual. It was subtle at first. He smiled at her, but there was an intensity behind it that felt almost too heavy. Caroline, trying to ignore the growing tension, shrugged it off. It could just be the stress of school, she thought. But as the movie played on, James' behavior became more apparent. He wasn't as engaged in their usual back and forth about the plot or the characters. Instead, he sat there, staring ahead, his expression unreadable. A silence hung between them, something deep and unspoken. Caroline asked if something was wrong, but James only shook his head, saying he was fine. Still, there was a distant look in his eyes, as if his mind was far away. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't about the movie or anything else. He turned to her, his voice quieter than usual, and said something that would change everything. "Mom," James started, his voice catching slightly, "I need to tell you something. Something important." Caroline was already on edge, but those words stopped her heart for a moment. She smiled softly, assuming it was something about his future plans or his studies. She had no idea what was coming next. James paused, gathering his thoughts. Before he said, "I've been feeling something that I don't know how to explain. It's not like what we've had before." Caroline furrowed her brows, unsure where this conversation was heading. "What do you mean?" James's voice trembled as he finally spoke, the words that shattered the silence between them. I think I've developed feelings for you, not just as a mother, but in a way that's more than that. I don't know how it happened, but I can't ignore it anymore." Caroline froze. The room seemed to tilt around her, her pulse quickening. The air between them felt thick, suffocating. Her son, her only child, had just confessed, something that defied everything she had ever known about their relationship. This wasn't love in the way she understood it. This was something forbidden, something that shattered the boundaries she thought they had. The moments after James's confession were suffocatingly still, and the silence between them felt unbearable. Caroline's mind raced, unable to fully comprehend what her son had just told her. She had spent over 2 decades raising him, nurturing him, watching him grow into a young man. But this was a reality she hadn't prepared for. She had always known that parenthood came with its own challenges, but this was something entirely different. James sat there, his body tense, his hands fidgeting with the napkin in his lap. His eyes were cast down, his face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and fear. Caroline could see how hard it was for him to even speak those words, and she could feel the weight of the confession pressing down on them both. But no matter how hard she tried to wrap her head around it, she couldn't shake the deep, sickening discomfort that settled in her stomach. "I'm sorry," James muttered, his voice cracking as he tried to find the right words to explain himself. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never meant for it to be this way, Mom. I've been feeling this way for a while now, and it's so hard to ignore. I tried to push it away, but it keeps coming back." Caroline swallowed hard, her throat dry. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words felt like they were stuck, tangled in a knot of disbelief and confusion. She wanted to tell him that it was okay, that feelings, however strange, were something they could work through, but she couldn't. She couldn't dismiss what he had said, not this, not something that was so fundamentally wrong. "You don't have to apologize, James. Caroline finally managed to say, though her voice was barely a whisper. But this isn't something a mother and son should feel for each other. I don't know what you're going through, but this is beyond just feelings. She watched him flinch, the pain in his eyes evident. He was clearly struggling with something deep within himself, something he didn't know how to explain or make sense of. Caroline's heart ached for him. She knew that his emotional turmoil wasn't coming from a place of malice or selfishness, but from something he couldn't control, something inside him that had simply surfaced. "I know," James said, his voice strained. "I don't even understand it myself. It feels wrong, Mom. I know it's wrong, but it's real. And I couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine. I've always felt close to you, so close. And now it's like something more. I don't know if I'm making any sense." Caroline shook her head, trying to clear the fog that clouded her thoughts. She had always encouraged James to be open about his feelings, to trust her with his heart. But this wasn't something she was prepared to handle. There was a line, a boundary that had been crossed, and neither of them knew how to return to what they had once shared. "I can't make sense of it, James. I can't. I need time." "We both do," Caroline replied, her voice unsteady. She leaned back in her chair, trying to collect her thoughts. But the more she thought about what he had said, the deeper the pit in her stomach grew. She wanted to believe that this was some fleeting emotional phase, something he would come to understand better with time. But the doubt gnawed at her. James didn't answer right away. Instead, he sat there, staring at his hands as if they held the answers. The discomfort in the room was palpable, and for the first time, Caroline felt as if there were an invisible wall between them. The easy bond they once had, one built on love, laughter, and shared moments, felt so distant now. Every glance at James felt like a reminder of what had been said, a reminder of the unspoken truth that they both were trying to process. After what felt like an eternity, James stood up slowly, as if the weight of the conversation had physically drained him. "I'm sorry, Mom, I'll go to my room. I didn't mean to upset you. I didn't want to make things awkward." His voice cracked again, and he turned to leave, his footsteps heavy against the floor. Caroline watched him leave, her chest tight with a mixture of sadness and frustration. She wanted to go after him, to hold him and tell him that everything would be okay, that they could get through this like they had with other challenges in their lives. But this wasn't like anything they had faced before. This wasn't a problem that could be fixed with a hug or a reassuring word. She felt completely unequipped to handle the storm inside of her son, let alone the storm brewing in herself. The silence in the room felt deafening. Caroline sat there, unable to move, unable to think clearly. She had spent so many years dedicated to giving James everything he needed: love, support, understanding. But now she was forced to confront a reality she never imagined: that her son, the child she had raised, had developed feelings for her that transcended the boundaries of their relationship. Caroline stood up slowly, walking over to the kitchen window, staring out at the darkening sky. She tried to steady her breathing, to calm the whirlwind of emotions that clouded her mind. She loved James, of course she did. But this love, it was not the kind of love that a mother should feel for her child. And this love, his love, was something she couldn't reciprocate. Her thoughts swirled in a chaotic mess. She wanted to comfort him, to ease his pain. But how could she do that without encouraging something that was so fundamentally wrong? What would happen to their relationship now? Could they ever go back to the way things were before? As Caroline stood there, lost in her thoughts, she realized just how much had changed in such a short time. She couldn't help but wonder, was this the beginning of the end? Of everything they had built together? Would James's feelings grow into something more? Something that neither of them could control? Or would time give them both the clarity they so desperately needed? But as the hours passed and the weight of the conversation settled in, one thing was clear: this wasn't just a phase. It wasn't something they could just ignore. Whatever had shifted between them, it was permanent. The days that followed, James's confession were excruciatingly difficult for both of them. The air between Caroline and James had thickened with an unspoken tension that neither of them knew how to navigate. Caroline tried to carry on with her routine, but every moment felt overshadowed by the weight of what had been revealed. The mother in her desperately wanted to go back to the way things were, to forget the conversation that had shattered their bond. But the reality was far more complex. James, for his part, was distant, too distant. He spent hours holed up in his room, avoiding eye contact with her, and when they did speak, his voice was tight, as if every word was painful to utter. Caroline didn't know if he was trying to protect her from his feelings, or if he was just too ashamed to face what he had confessed. Every time he looked at her, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, an emotion she couldn't place. It was as if he was fighting an internal battle, one that no amount of love could easily resolve. But the tension in the house reached a boiling point one evening. Caroline had spent most of the afternoon in the kitchen, trying to distract herself with tasks, hoping that if she stayed busy, the thoughts of James's words would fade into the background. But when the clock ticked past 7 p.m. and James had still not come down for dinner, she felt a surge of anxiety. She knew he was still in his room, but it had been hours since they last spoke. The silence between them felt suffocating. She knocked lightly on his door, her heart pounding in her chest. "James?" she called softly, her voice tentative. There was no answer, but she knew he was in there. Taking a deep breath, Caroline turned the knob and stepped inside. James was sitting on the edge of his bed, his hands gripping the sheets, tightly as if trying to keep himself tethered to the present. His back was turned to her, and he didn't acknowledge her presence right away. The weight of his posture, the stiffness of his shoulders, told Caroline everything she needed to know. He was still wrestling with the storm inside him, and this time, it seemed like the storm was winning. "James, we need to talk," Caroline said, her voice barely above a whisper. She stepped forward, her eyes searching for any sign of acknowledgement. But James didn't move. He stayed frozen, as though her words didn't reach him. "I can't keep pretending this is okay," she continued, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I'm your mother. I don't know how to process what you told me. But we can't keep avoiding this. We have to face it. Please talk to me." Finally, James turned his head slightly, just enough for her to see his face. His eyes were red-rimmed, and there was a look of deep, unbearable sorrow etched across his features. For a moment, Caroline thought she saw a flicker of relief in his eyes. Like maybe, just maybe, he was grateful that she had come to him, offering a chance to talk. But when he spoke, his voice was hollow, distant. "I don't know how, Mom. I don't know what I'm supposed to say. I've tried to figure this out, to make sense of it. But I can't. It just feels like I'm trapped in something I can't escape." Caroline felt a sharp pang in her chest. Her son was in pain, deep, profound pain. And as much as it hurt her to hear the words come out of his mouth, she understood. She understood that what he had felt, what he had confessed, wasn't just some fleeting emotion. It was real. It was something that had been brewing for months, maybe even years. And now it was out in the open, lingering in the air like a storm cloud that refused to dissipate. "James, I don't know what to do either," Caroline said, her voice shaking as the tears she had been holding back began to spill over. "I love you. You're my son, and I've always been proud of you. But I can't be everything for you. I can't be the one to carry this burden." She took a step closer, her heart breaking at the sight of him so vulnerable. "I want you to understand that I love you as my son. That's who you are to me, and I need you to let go of whatever it is that's holding you in this place. This isn't right, James, and I can't keep pretending it is." James's face contorted with frustration, and for the first time, Caroline saw a flicker of anger in his eyes. "I don't know how to let it go, Mom. It's not something I can just switch off. It's not something I can erase. It's real." He stood up abruptly, his fist clenched at his sides. "You don't understand. You don't know what it's like to feel this way. You don't know how hard it is to fight something that feels like it's part of me." Caroline recoiled slightly, feeling the sharpness of his words. She knew he was hurting, but she also knew that this pain wasn't something she could take away. She was the mother. She was supposed to protect him, guide him, but now she didn't know how to protect him from himself, from this uncontrollable force inside him that had shattered everything they had once known. "I do understand," Caroline said softly, her voice firm but tender. "I understand more than you think. But this isn't a fight I can fight for you. You have to fight it on your own. You have to let go, James." For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the only sound being the quiet hum of the air conditioning in the background. James's shoulders sagged, and his anger seemed to drain away, replaced by a deep exhaustion. He sank back down onto the bed, burying his face in his hands, overwhelmed by the enormity of what had just happened. "I don't know how to fix this, Mom," he whispered, his voice broken. "I don't know if I can." Caroline sat beside him, her heart aching as she placed a hand gently on his shoulder. She didn't have the answers. She didn't know how to make everything okay. But she knew that they had to figure this out together. no matter how painful or uncomfortable it was. The love they had, though shaken, was still there, and perhaps in time, that love would be enough to rebuild the bond they had. "I'm here," Caroline said softly, the words filled with as much strength as she could muster. "I'm here, James, and no matter what, I'll always be your mother." It was a small, fragile moment of connection, but it was a start. A start that neither of them knew would be enough to heal the wound, but one that offered a glimmer of hope in the midst of the storm. As the days passed after that night, the house seemed quieter, emptier, as though the very walls were trying to absorb the tension that had settled between them. Caroline and James both tried to return to their routines, but something had irrevocably changed. They shared fleeting moments, glances in the hallway, brief exchanges over dinner, but the intimacy that once characterized their relationship was gone. There was no longer the easy comfort of simply being in each other's presence. Instead, there was an underlying discomfort, a lingering heaviness that neither of them knew how to lift. Caroline spent the next few weeks in a state of emotional limbo, unsure of where to go from here. She would lie awake at night, turning over the events in her mind, wondering where things had gone wrong. Her maternal instincts screamed at her to fix it, to make everything right again. But the deeper she delved into the situation, the more impossible it seemed to find a way back to the way things were. She had tried to find solace in the idea that time would heal their wounds, that the emotional distance between them would lessen with every passing day. But no amount of time could erase the truth of what had been revealed. Caroline understood now more than ever that what James had confessed wasn't just a temporary feeling. It was something deep within him, something that had emerged from a complex web of emotions. And it was a part of him that she couldn't simply ignore or dismiss. But for Caroline, the deeper realization was that love wasn't just about the intense emotions they had once shared. It was about boundaries. It was about respect. And in that moment, as much as it hurt her, she understood that some bonds had to be redefined. The love she had for James would never go away. He was her son, and she would always care for him. But that love had to be protected, reshaped, and distanced from the confusion of the feelings that had been exposed. It was the hardest decision she had ever made, but she knew it was the only one she could make to preserve the integrity of their relationship and prevent it from becoming something that could never be undone. As for James, the days were equally challenging. There were moments when he longed for the way things used to be, when his connection with his mother felt pure, uncomplicated, and full of affection. But there was a quiet acceptance growing in him as well. He had hoped for a different outcome, one where his feelings could somehow be returned, understood, or at least accepted without judgment. But deep down, he knew that what he had felt couldn't be ignored, and that the very nature of his emotions had created an unbridgeable gap between them. He had crossed a line, and now both he and Caroline had to navigate the aftermath of that revelation. James found himself spending more time at school, focusing on his studies, trying to distance himself from the guilt and confusion that had been weighing him down. He had always been a good student, but now his studies felt like a welcome distraction. It was a place where he could focus on something tangible, something he could control, rather than the storm of emotions that seemed to engulf him at every turn. The absence of his mother in his life, both physically and emotionally, was something he was learning to live with. But it didn't come without its own heartache. He had loved the bond they shared, and now, the silence between them felt like a void he couldn't fill. One evening, as Caroline sat alone in the living room, the glow of the television casting soft shadows across the room, she found herself reflecting on everything that had transpired. She thought about James's face, how raw and vulnerable he had looked when he had confessed his feelings. She thought about the guilt in his eyes, the weight of a burden he had carried alone for far too long. And despite everything, she couldn't help but feel for him. He was her son, and no matter how complicated or painful their relationship had become, that bond would never be entirely severed. But Caroline also knew that the time had come for them to take separate paths in their healing. There was no quick fix to the emotional scars that had been left behind, and there was no simple solution. They would have to rebuild their relationship, but it would require patience and understanding. Two things neither of them had in abundance right now. In the weeks that followed, Caroline found herself having quiet conversations with herself, reflecting on the complexities of motherhood. She thought about how love, when left unchecked, could become confusing, even dangerous. She thought about how easily it could be misinterpreted and how vulnerable both parents and children were to the pull of deep emotions. And while she couldn't change what had happened, she could control how she chose to move forward. James, too, began to find some peace with the situation. He understood that, in time, the distance between him and his mother might lessen. He hoped that with maturity and self-reflection, they might rebuild a connection founded on respect and boundaries, even if it would never be the same as it once was. He realized that he needed to forgive himself, first before he could even begin, to repair what had been broken. And though it hurt, he knew that what he had felt for Caroline, while real, was not something that could be nurtured in the way he had imagined. He would learn, in time, to accept the love they shared as a mother and son, and that would have to be enough. In the end, the story of Caroline and James wasn't about a love lost, but a love that had to evolve. It was about two people, bound by blood, by shared memories, by the deep, indelible connection of family, learning to redefine their relationship in the wake of confusion and emotional turmoil. Their bond had been tested, strained, and altered, but it hadn't disappeared. It would remain, albeit in a new form, one built on understanding, boundaries, and the painful reality that sometimes love needs space to grow. If you found this story moving or thought-provoking, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our community for more emotional journeys like this. We dive deep into stories that explore love, relationships, and the complexities of human emotions. Subscribe now and make sure you never miss an episode. There's always more to discover. See you in the next video!